Hey guys, so this week we're gonna sort of continue on the theme of how land protection plays into climate mitigation. Um, the presentation that I'm going to give today is really the product of a year-long research effort. It included literature review, conversations with practitioners in the field, and this really focuses in on freshwater flooding as a hazard, some of the strategies that are relevant to how land protection fits in to the picture. Um, this is mostly focused on the eastern United States, and this case study in particular is focused in on the north coast of South Carolina, um, with a city that was very engaged with land trust partners over the years and in working through land protection as a flood mitigation strategy. So there are sort of 5 strategies to highlight, and all 5 of these strategies are also part of the report that focus in on flood mitigation, flood hazards, and some targeted land protection or planning strategies. Some of these include policy measures that could be important. So the examples include tools and case studies, a summary of the land trust role, and pros and challenges of implementation for each of these strategies in the report that is part of the reading this week. The case study actually addresses all 5 of these strategies in various ways. So as we kind of talk through the strategies, we'll also talk through how they've been applied in the field. So the case study that we'll use today, the Lower PD watershed in South Carolina, is the confluence of 5 river systems: the Little PD, the Great PD, the Waccamaw, the Black River, and the Sand Pit. The city of Conway is about 30 miles inland from Myrtle Beach, along the Waccamaw River, and that community really identifies as a river town. It celebrates the beautiful Blackwater River that comes through the downtown. The downtown includes a river walk and a lot of sort of river-oriented community events. But this town has also been ravaged by riverine flooding in the past 15 years. 3 historic floods occurred within a 5-year period, the worst of those being Hurricane Florence that hit in 2018. So let's talk about permanent protection as a flood mitigation strategy. So the idea of using permanent protection as a strategy really is twofold. One is if we can protect riverine properties that are flood prone, we displace the possibility of those being built. And so sort of having bad idea developments that are likely to flood in the future. But then the double down is that these properties also sequester water, can slow the speed of water, the velocity of water that can really ravage built areas in a community like the city of Conway. So I think we can always look at it as a twofold strategy to see these riverfront properties permanently protected and kept in natural habitat condition. So the example of the city of Conway was that that town already identified with this river. So there was sort of a dual focus on protection along the river, one for the scenic qualities of protecting these large tracts that were mostly bottomland hardwood forest with some developable uplands on many of them. So protecting the viewshed, protecting the quality of the river, but then also protecting these properties for their flood mitigation potential. In the picture, you see on the right side, the property in orange and red was a target property right across the river from the city itself. This property was acquired, a portion of it went to the Waccamaw National Wildlife Refuge. The northern parcel was outside of the boundary of the Waccamaw National Wildlife Refuge. And the city of Conway actually decided to take on that property as a city park, a sort of passive recreation city park with trails and some picnic areas, a kayak launch, and a disc golf course highlighted on that property. Other targets that the conservation community worked on with the city of Conway are shown in the brighter green color. And we'll talk about a few of the other pieces that fit in here as well. A task force group worked together to identify these properties as priorities. That conservation task force group was focused on this section of the Waccamaw River, focused on acquiring tracts that added to the Waccamaw National Wildlife Refuge, placing conservation easements on properties, and really working with the town and the county to make sure that conservation was implemented and prioritized within relevant government plans. So the Waccamaw River Park ended up being a high-profile success. It really engaged the county council, the town council of the city of Conway, the mayor, and a lot of the citizens at a new level and a new way in the role that these protected lands might play in offering nice recreational benefits and also these flood benefits to the community. Another property that sort of came to fruition around the same time or shortly after the Waccamaw River tract that the city of Conway and Waccamaw Refuge acquired was known as the Westmoreland tract. It was 159 acres. What was interesting about this property is that the city agreed to hold title to this property, but really purely with the lens of thinking about it as contributing to flood mitigation efforts for the city. And so it was a property that was acquired with funding from NAWCA, from the North American Wetland Conservation Act program, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So even though the funds that were used to acquire the property were wildlife oriented in sort of their mission and the way the proposal was written, the purpose for the town was as much about mitigating flooding as it was protecting the scenic viewshed and the wildlife in this corridor. So when the press came out about this successful protection and acquisition of this property, it was oriented around that goal of preserving the land to help mitigate flooding. It was important messaging, I think, for this property for folks to kind of connect the dots around the role that land conservation can play. And one of the reasons this was such a successful endeavor in communication was that the conservation partners had worked with the city of Conway and a geospatial analyst to actually evaluate the flood benefits of some of these North Coast floodplains around the city of Conway. And so they focused in on a 65 square mile roughly area so north and east of Conway along the river systems. And they used a GIS method. One of some of the elements that this model incorporated was how much water the floodplain currently holds, the monetary value of the floodwater storage in terms of damages avoided to homes and businesses that are downstream. So that study actually allowed for a very quantifiable approach to describing the value of these floodplain wetlands. The upstream floodplains on average protected about 47,000, prevented about 47,000 in flood damage per structure in that area of analysis. And so really tangible sort of ecosystem service result in this study. The undeveloped floodplains also prevented 1.4 million to 8 million in damages to downstream communities per river flooding event, depending on the severity of the storm. And on average, the model was able to calculate that 65 square mile floodplain area displaced about 6.1 million annually. A nice thing about this analysis is that there was a mechanism to actually clip the analysis down to a parcel so that we could better understand and articulate a parcel level benefit. So that same area, the 488 acre RMS Waccamaw River tract, provided Conway about $337,000 per year in avoided damage cost. Just that one parcel contributed that amount. The 167 acre Westmoreland Preserve tract provides about $102,000 per year in avoided damages cost. And so what this meant for us was that the cost to purchase those properties paid for themselves in about 3 years in the flood mitigation value being offered by these tracts. Another high-level strategy is flood hazard, in this flood hazard mitigation report were voluntary buyouts. So we'll talk a little bit about those in another example from this community. Floodplain buyouts using FEMA post-disaster funds are sort of a complex way to achieve land protection, but there seems to be a good argument for how we can use FEMA thoughtfully and end up with both a floodplain benefit, a community benefit, and hopefully other layered benefits that could include wildlife habitat, scenic view sheds, recreational value, and others. When you look at the way communities have used FEMA to buy properties out in the past, what often happens is we end up with a checkerboard of small protected lots that are owned by the community or a county. These lots often end up being grass lots that are mowed. They don't have a whole lot of connective functioning value or recreational value to speak of. So one of the general needs out there is, and a role that land trusts could play, is actually thoughtfully assembling some buyout tracts, understanding ahead of a storm if there are willing sellers that are in the path of flooding that have been flooded before, and then being able to sort of put these pieces together into a plan that creates natural area space, recreational space, sort of additive benefits on top of just removing structures out of harm's way, which is really the way a lot of the FEMA post-disaster funding has been used in the past. So after Hurricane Florence, that same partnership that had worked together so closely on the park properties that had been acquired near Conway came together and thought about, are there some buyouts that could happen because of the post-disaster funds that would be available for that region. And it turned out that with some detailed mapping and thinking, these 30 some odd parcels came out as a high priority. You can see that these properties actually connect protected area within Waccamaw National Wildlife Refuge, and they're also part of the refuge acquisition boundary. And so that gave a pathway to potentially acquire these properties, remove structures, and rewild them to actually donate them to the Waccamaw Refuge to be included and incorporated into the refuge ownership and management. This strategy of non-government organizations working with a conservation lens on FEMA buyouts is one that hasn't happened all that much across the country. So this was a novel project. It was one that actually Ducks Unlimited stepped up to be the partner to lead on this project. It included going door to door and sending flyers to each of these landowners to ask if they were potentially willing sellers that were interested in selling their property. And it would have included also having to remove the structures from that property, being accountable for that. That was part of the funding application to include the dollars required to remove structures. As you might imagine, these neighborhoods are ones that have been flooded multiple times, and many landowners are accustomed to sort of picking themselves up and fixing their houses and weren't necessarily interested in a buyout. But there were several that were. So the Ducks Unlimited was able to assemble a package of 4 or 5 property owners that were willing and ready to sell their property, and of course created a pathway for communication for other landowners that might be willing to do a buyout in the future in another storm event. A couple of other strategies that are worth discussion are floodplain regulations, so town or county level ordinances policies that help to protect the floodplain and limit development within the floodplain. And the other one we'll talk a little bit about is FEMA's community rating system that actually has a important element that includes land protection in the scoring. So let's talk a little bit about landscape scale flood storage and the role that can play and how that fits into the FEMA CRS program. So this is a different shot from the map on the right from a place not too far away from the city of Conway within Horry County, South Carolina. And you can see the properties in red are conservation targets that fit within sort of landscape scale protection that's already in place. Hurricane Florence flooding in Georgetown, there was, during that flood event, a model that researchers built that predicted that the town of Georgetown was going to go underwater. And when that prediction did not come true, researchers wanted to better understand and dig in and study just what was happening here. And some of these researchers are actually Clemson University scientists that were working on this explanation. So the flooding in Georgetown County ended up being mitigated by three factors that really can only be partially separated. But the first was this large, expansive floodplain of the PD, the Lynches and the Little PD rivers. The peak flow coming into that area was showing that it was storing about 1 million acre feet of water. And then it was releasing that water slowly over a 10-day period. So the hydrologists had predicted that that volume of water from the flood was going to move through that floodplain area much more quickly and actually put Georgetown underwater. But the impact of that flood storage was really pretty remarkable. That section of water, they can tell from the gauge data that the flooding depth and the peak flow rates were much smaller just downstream, despite just really large additional flow from the Little PD. The peak was actually delayed, much delayed from the models. They were able to look at that area, about 156,000 acres in that region, and rough calculations showed that there was about 7.9 feet of water that was parked across that 156,000 acre area over that 10-day period when it was slowly released. And it was a fascinating event to be able to kind of go back and better understand why the hydrologic models were wrong and increase our understanding of these mature forest floodplain areas and what kind of role they can play in a major flood event. So one of the benefits of having this sort of landscape scale land protection in place is that there is a incentive program through FEMA that actually allows landowners and property owners with that pay flood insurance to have lower flood insurance rates if their community is following some best practices for flood prevention. And so Horry County had gone through the process of completing a FEMA community rating system application, and one of the scoring elements, really quite a powerful scoring element in that application, was quantifying the amount of the floodplain that is in permanently protected status. And there are not many programs out there or examples when land protection actually has a very quantifiable dollar benefit to the communities that that surround it. And this is a quantifiable benefit. Every ratepayer, flood insurance ratepayer in Horry County ended up getting about a $60 reduction. And a big part of that reduction was the demonstrated permanent land protection for properties within the Horry County floodplain. So it's quite a bit of work for the city or county planner that pulls this application together. They actually have to pull every conservation easement, have those attached to the application, and there are lots of other incentives that they're able to demonstrate. Some include ordinances that are more conservative as far as where they allow people to build in the floodplain. So when we look at prospective land conservation projects now, we can actually sort of anticipate and quantify the benefit to a FEMA CRS application. It can be one of the values or benefits that we articulate for the larger community. So in this case, when we were looking at these red areas as a potential protection project, those additional 12,000 acres in Horry County would have equaled to about a 25% increase in floodplain protection in the county, and would have added quite a bit, they're measurable benefits for the ratepayers. It would have earned the county about an 18% more of the possible points, which accounts for about 35% of the total count of points. And at the end of the day, as we said, that accounted for about a $70 insurance reduction per ratepayer in that community. Last thing I wanted to mention was this, the idea of floodplain regulation, and land trusts certainly can dip a pinky toe into commenting on or making suggestions for best practices for floodplain regulation. In this particular community, they ended up with an ordinance on the books that required that any new construction or any major renovations put the lowest floor 2 feet above the FEMA flood maps, so the 100-year flood zones. There were no basements allowed in this permitting, and if there were going to be solid walls built below that that bottom floor that's 2 feet above the flood level, that it had to accommodate movement of water, and so really unobstructed movement of water, which of course adds to the stability of a structure in a flood situation. So these floodplain regulations are something that it's important for community groups to understand, and we can be advocates for as well.